and it's still kind of in the oven, so you get a little bit of a taste before everyone else. Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tutalomanican people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. Furthermore, the labor of enslaved Black people also generated revenue and enabled the creation of Virginia Tech. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tutalomanican peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by providing fully funded degrees for Native students, increasing faculty recruitment, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. And I will be sending some links shortly also, so you can check out the Tutalomanican Nations webpage and also the American Indian Indigenous Community Center's webpage to get some more information. And before we kick things off here, I'd like to do a little quick plug for another webinar we're going to be having next week, which is the final webinar for this very long COVID-19 semester. It's called Titaxtagetsan Ipanpane Nahuatl, preserving and revitalizing Nahuatl language and culture in Cuxcatan, which is Western El Salvador. So we hope to see you there. I'll be sending the link as well in the chat so you can sign up for this event if you are interested. And with that, let's switch over now to today's activities. The reason you're here, presumably not to listen to me talk, right? I'm going to introduce Dr. Julie Reed, who is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and an associate professor of history at Penn State University. Julie's research focuses on Southeastern Indians, the history of social welfare, and American educational history. She is currently wrapping up her second book, tentatively titled Land, Language, and Women, A Cherokee and American Educational History. Her first book, Serving the Nation, Cherokee Sovereignty and Social Welfare, 1800 to 1907, examined the move from kinship-based systems of care at the turn of the century to the development of national social service programs and institutions, including pensions, a prison, mental health facilities, and an orphanage in an aftermath of the Civil War. She has also co-authored articles in Antiquity and American Antiquity that examine early uses of Cherokee syllabary in caves in the Southeast. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Reed, who will be giving us a very insightful and timely conversation about epidemics and education. So very relevant at the moment, as we all unfortunately know. Dr. Reed, please. Thank you. There you go.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. And I swear I'm not 9 feet tall. I'm just in my attic, which is where my office space is. So I realize my backdrop may look a little strange. So I just want to, again, thank you for hosting me. Wish it was under other conditions, even as we probably are all starting to get vaccinated. It still feels like we're a while away from being able to have these in-person gatherings yet again. And so again, thank you for showing up in these virtual spaces, especially this late in the semester when I know we're probably all hitting a point of needing a break going into the summer. So again, my thanks. So I am, again, I'm wrapping up a book project, which is chronologically quite long. I am starting in the archaeological record in my early chapters and moving into the 20th century by the final chapter. So it's a broad and really long chronological span. Feels very nerve-wracking as somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about very detailed research for the first book. And so what you're getting today is the later chapter, or portions of the later chapter, that look at kind of Oklahoma education in the post-statehood moment. And I'm sure a lot of you're going to hear things that you already know quite a bit about. So bear with me if I'm telling you things perhaps that you already know about. So hopefully I can do this fairly informally so that it doesn't it doesn't feel too terrible this late in the semester and this late in the day. So essentially, what I want to spend some time on today is thinking about this kind of post 1918 flu pandemic moment. And as I was researching the final chapter and looking at the public schools and school settings in Oklahoma, and of course, living through a pandemic ourselves, I began to get preoccupied with stories that were showing up relative to the 1918 pandemic. It's also an event that had a profound impact within the Cherokee Nation in terms of the loss of elders, much like we're seeing today with our Native communities, the loss of our language through the loss of those speakers, but also spiritual leaders, right? That historians, and anytime you have one of these pandemics and you lose your elders in particular, you're losing vast educational resources available to the rest of us. So I needed to kind of think through this moment in a much broader way, because obviously the flu pandemic of 1918 is happening kind of a bigger moment, right? That allotment is still playing out in all sorts of ways, in that, you know, Cherokee Nation's allotment process played out from 1898 to 1914 in terms of kind of finalizing those roles. Oklahoma statehood, of course, is, you know, Oklahoma's a baby at this point. It's barely a state, and much of what it's gained through Oklahoma statehood has come at the expense of the 5 tribes. So many of the institutions built by the 5 tribes, which I spend time talking about in my first book, have become the state of Oklahoma has benefited from all of that institution building that the 5 tribes did, as well as other tribes. And then, of course, it's coming in the midst of war, right? And then I want to think through this moment as not just the flu pandemic itself, but the waves of implications that come in the wake of that flu pandemic, and changes that are made and attitudes that are shaped by that flu pandemic. And of course, just some other kinds of like Oklahoma events and national events is that you have the 19th Amendment women's suffrage playing out in 1920, the Osage Reign of Terror, which there's currently a film being made. For those of you that are following this to kind of play out, this is happening between 1921 and 26. Also alerting ourselves to the fact that, like, although the Osage Reign of Terror is one extreme example, there are pieces of this playing out amongst all of the 5 tribes as well. So there are elements of people being not necessarily murdered in such high degrees, but certainly are being institutionalized in some cases in order to get access to land, are being abused in other kinds of ways in order to get access to the resources attached to Native people's land. And then additionally, as we're kind of paying attention to in this 100th anniversary year, the Tulsa Race Massacre occurs in 1921 in the Greenwood community. And then we also have to put this in the context of the fact that the Great Depression kind of sinks in much earlier in Oklahoma than it does in other places. So because of the kind of farming practices that went on and the land conditions in Oklahoma, that there's already some changes happening agriculturally that are leading to some pretty severe conditions for peoples in Oklahoma generally, but for Native peoples in particular, especially as a result of allotment and statehood. And so I'm really interested in this kind of aftermath and the larger context of this moment. And I also am interested in how Native people managed this moment. I mean, that statehood kind of takes away some of the organizing abilities of the Native nations to kind of act collectively. So just to recap as to what allotment did, and you can see in the background of this slide, a map of the Cherokee Nation with the kind of allotment pieces built in. So it broke up that communal land base into individual plots of land given out to individual members of the community. The total acreage was supposed to be 160 acres, 120 for the farm, 40 for the homestead. But the Cherokees didn't actually have enough land to make that happen. And so a lot of allotments were actually smaller than that 160 acres. And then of course, like the allotment process played out in other Native nations. Your farm may not be in close proximity to your home, and that made it very difficult. Or some families chose to live on a spouse's allotment as opposed to living on the allotment they were assigned to. And of course, the larger process this is the moment when we start to see blood quantification come into play in severe ways that the legacies are still with us today. So the entire process is kind of not only disconnecting Native peoples from tribal governments, but it's also meant to, in many ways, disconnect Native peoples from this larger swath of land that had been collectively owned since the time of removal. Now, in terms of statehood, I think we talk about, if you've read, for instance, some of the literature on the Native South, we spend a lot of time thinking about the role of gender and the history of matrilineality and matrilocality amongst the 5 tribes, but amongst Southeastern tribes more broadly. And that gender is kind of constantly under attack, constantly trying to be, the gender norms are constantly being remade. And even at statehood, we saw this again. And this is symbolized through a symbolic marriage between a white man representing Oklahoma Territory and a Cherokee woman representing Indian Territory. And they held this kind of live action marriage ceremony in order to kind of forge these 2 spaces together. And at the same time, create kind of a male head of household model by which Native peoples were supposed to somehow have consented to this marriage. And yet that isn't in fact what was happening. Most Native peoples were pushing back on statehood. And of course, the 5 tribes specifically had attempted to create the state of Sequoia, which would have been a native state. I mean, in theory, that would have given more governing power to Native peoples within that region already. So again, this kind of symbolic marriage that kind of misrepresents the entire relationship, and it is also, arguably coercive in all sorts of ways. So again, like just to give us a kind of quick timeline, World War I is playing out from 1914 to 1918. The US, of course, doesn't enter the war until 1917. And then, of course, we have the flu pandemic set in 1918. And it's worth noting that, of course, that there were misnomers attached to that pandemic. It got assigned to, in fact, the Spanish flu, when in fact the first cases are documented in the state in Kansas, and added to that it's a military location where in fact lots of Native people were passing through as they were both shipping out and coming from the war. And so many of these people are Native soldiers in particular are returning home to their communities. And are arguably bringing the Spanish flu with them, or the flu with them, the pandemic itself with them. And so Cherokee Nation, formerly these are all stories from areas that were in fact previously Cherokee Nation jurisdictional areas and the boundaries. So you see there's lots of reporting from these papers that are coming out of what used to be the Cherokee Nation where Cherokee people are residing, that in fact the flu pandemic is setting in a whole variety of ways, some deeper. So if you look at the kind of center top newspaper article, that the farmers are being impacted. They're not able to keep up with their crops because in fact they're sick. They're talking about one of the schools doing fairly okay in spite of the flu itself. And then again, thinking about who the victims of the flu are. So even within this space that was formerly the Cherokee Nation, there's an unevenness to how people are being impacted throughout the year. And so much like we've seen within this kind of current moment that we're living in, the unevenness to it, the kind of ways in which some spaces are hit pretty hard initially, other people are still waiting for their waves to hit. And so you see this even within the confines of these 14 counties of Oklahoma immediately after statehood. And I should note, like the Woodall School that is featured on the bottom left on my screen. I'm not sure if it's bottom right on your screen, but the Woodall School is actually a Cherokee serving school. So again, kind of thinking about how these things played out in the community and the way the community is writing about and thinking about the flu pandemic within the community. And of course, they're also, you know, Native nations are also keeping up with kind of larger events writ large. So this was and thinking about these things side by side. So on the one hand, this is from the Claremore Progress in 1918, and you see these two stories kind of side by side. That on the one hand, we have the story about the influenza with some recommendations about how to manage the flu. You'll see that some of those recommendations are surprisingly similar to those that we have used over the last year ourselves. And then side by side with that is this question of women's suffrage. And of course, there's a lot going on in terms of kind of looking at what's going on in Texas and thinking about Arkansas and those regional neighbors. And then, of course, giving the kind of numbers on how would this play out in Oklahoma specifically. But again, both of these are kind of preoccupations that again, Claremore is a formerly Cherokee Nation town, still heavily populated by Cherokees today. And these are the stories that are being covered kind of during the pandemic itself. So generally, this is a period that we associate with tremendous political and economic change. And I contrast that, as other historians have also done, that the allotment moment and the statehood moment are really different, perhaps, than those conditions that were faced during the 19th century. And we often think about removal as this incredibly devastating moment. And there's no doubt that demographically, removal was devastating. There's no doubt that economically, removal was devastating to many people. We know, no doubt that it was politically divisive, and those political divides lasted for generations. Arguably, we're still living with those divides today. But unlike the 19th century, unlike that earlier moment, there isn't a clearly defined Cherokee governing body that can act on behalf of kind of the larger body of Cherokee people. So the government had been dissolved. There is kind of still acting chiefs who are being appointed by the federal government, but these are not official Cherokee leaders being democratically elected. Additionally, communal land holdings, even though many families and many communities are trying to still remain committed and support each other, communal land holdings have been completely broken up. And this has been kind of a social welfare safety net throughout the 19th century as well. That if land wasn't producing, you simply moved to land that could better support you. But with this land divided, Native peoples are not able to kind of make those shifts in the ways that they could have throughout the 19th century. And then, of course, the other thing that is worth noting is that schools and educational facilities, and this is true again amongst the 5 tribes more broadly, but true of the Cherokee specifically, is that schools had been advocated for quite early. The Cherokee Nation had built up its public school system. One of the first things it does after removal, when Cherokees can't agree on anything else in 1841, is when they passed their Public School Act, making education universally available in this post-removal moment. And then went on to build seminaries and went on to establish a whole array of educational institutions and educational structures, like the physical buildings themselves. And this is a period where Cherokees are no longer in control of the governance of those schools. And then in general, this is a period where the United States wants to deal with Cherokees as individual citizens of the United States, as opposed to collective members of a Native nation. So there isn't the ability to kind of collectively go to bat for the entirety of the Cherokee Nation, because people are operating as kind of individual citizens. And of course, the there's a whole argument to be made for the way that individualism has actually been used as a weapon against tribes over time. So some slight differences. Again, I want us to kind of, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because, again, belaboring things you probably already know about, but it's worth kind of thinking about, like, what else is playing out in this moment? Well, we've got Jim Crow laws. We've got massive immigration numbers increasing. We've got kind of deepening nativism. We've got larger policies of eugenics developing. There's another rise of the KKK happening, or significant wealth gaps that exist. And so all of this is in play as the flu pandemic is setting in, and then of course doesn't go away in the wake of the kind of after the flu pandemic is dissipating. So, what I'm really interested in is, like, what is the impact of this moment on the most vulnerable Cherokee people during this period? Because there is a whole, there's a way in which we have to think about the fact that the Cherokee Nation did a lot of institutional work and did a lot of educational work in the period from removal to statehood. And so there are lots of Cherokees who are doing just fine in this post-statehood moment. I mean, one of the first US senators from Oklahoma is Robert L. Owens, a former citizen of the Cherokee Nation. So there are ways in which many Cherokee people have made the leap from Cherokee Nation citizenship to American citizenship just fine. They had the educational acumen, they had the resources, they have potentially whiteness operating on their behalf relative to kind of being able to move through an increasingly racialized and racialized state in a way that's perhaps some of their both phenotypically Cherokee and Black Cherokee counterparts cannot. So I started digging around for questions about education, questions about public health, kind of larger dominant attitudes that are playing out in this period, and then looking at these effects both at a macro level and a micro level. And just to give you a sense, like, one of the things that becomes immediately clear is that during this period, it's really difficult to pull public health apart from education more broadly. And so, for instance, you'll see on the left of your screen, or possibly the right, I never know, the health tournament is going to be held again. And this is 1922, an article from the Vienne Press in 1922. And you'll see that the tournament is carried on by the children's observance of health chores or rules for keeping well. These include washing hands before each meal, weekly baths, brushing teeth twice daily, sleeping with open windows, outdoor exercise, and other health habits. Now, I'm not sure how they're monitoring all of this or how you would log some of these things, but the schools are hosting contests to kind of promote and reward those schools deemed the most hygienic students. So it's nearly impossible as you start looking through educational records at the state and even the local level to kind of not see how much public health is a preoccupation within the schools more broadly. And as I was digging around in some of these education reports, one of the things that was devastating is that we have the kind of language of the 5 tribes being the civilized tribes, right? This moniker has been applied to them for more than about 100 years at this point. Most of the 5 tribes embraced this in some ways. And yet what these records suggest is the ways in which many Native families during this period are suffering in ways that they have that I don't see in documents in the 19th century, the way that I see them being described in these first decades of Oklahoma statehood. And the language used to describe Native peoples and the five tribes specifically is there's an ugliness to it that I just, again, don't regularly see in records throughout the 19th century that continually shows up. And that shows up in some really specific ways around ideas about cleanliness, ideas about education. And so I pulled this chart. This is from a book called Public Education in Oklahoma, published in 1922. And you'll see they kind of created this chart with some basic numbers. But then they're listing, again, the situation of homes, the condition of homes, the condition of the farms, the health, and questions about accessibility, questions about what kinds of food people are growing. And on the one hand, like this chart also points out some really interesting continuities and how Native peoples are continuing to kind of live their lives in this post-statehood moment. Like corn is still being grown. Like this is still a piece of Cherokee people's lives that has not been abated. On the other hand, you see this language of again, like if you look to the text on my screen that I've kind of pulled out from this, that full bloods are markedly careless in the care of children. And of course, they're highlighting that some Cherokees are dealing with cocaine habits and that peyote use is a major problem. And again, no information on where they're actually pulling this from, but the ways that they're beginning to kind of demonize Native families and Native peoples around public health is really telling in these records. In the same report, there's a classification of who are they? How do we break down who these Native peoples are? And particularly there's a section where they're talking about Cherokees, Creeks, and Choctaws, and they're classifying them in three ways. Again, these town Indians who send children to town or boarding schools, junior colleges in nearby states, and their parents are leaders in communities. Again, this is kind of that category of people, many of whom have made the leap to statehood without much difficulty. Then they have the second group of full bloods and many mixed bloods who live in 2 to 4 room log houses in the country that are not well kept, they're untidy, but they're not dirty. Their children attend boarding or district schools. Their parents are eager to see children advance, but they will remove kids from school for important reasons. And often that important reason cited in other sections is farming, for instance. So that, again, the need for children to continue contributing to the family in economically, but also in the ways that they always would have. Then there's this third category. And these are the full bloods or nearly so. And they're not more advanced than, quote, so-called pagan Indian people. And they lived far from the paths of civilization. I mean, these are now we're into like the tropes of Native savagery all over again that we can read about for decades and arguably for hundreds of years within larger records. And these full-blood people live in 1 to 3 room log homes in the hills with little furniture except beds. And then children of this third group are often undesirable in public schools because of the previously mentioned diseases which follow lack of cleanliness. So I should stop and say that, like, when I'm reading these records, this is the first, my first book kind of stops at Oklahoma statehood with a little bit of an epilogue that kind of looks forward to the future. But this is the first time that I'm dealing in records where people I know and love lived through these moments. And so as I'm reading these records and as I'm stopping to think about them, I often had to say, where does my family, like, how is my family being classified? Where did we fit into all of this? And it was really difficult kind of making my way through some of these records, thinking about, like, I know that my family lived in a 1 to 3 room log home in the more hilly parts of the Cherokee Nation and had little more in their house except for beds, and continued to participate in the Gadua Society, and descended from people who were, who were very committed to more traditional religious practices, and who were attending boarding schools because they were, maybe undesirable in the public schools. And I also began to kind of revisit questions I've asked about my own family's history relative to so for instance, my dad's experiences of childhood. My dad was born in 43. So this is kind of that immediate generation before my dad's born. So thinking about his experiences, and that this is the backdrop to my own father's childhood experience in these areas. And I spent a lot of time thinking about and pulling from papers that were particular to my own family's community in Oklahoma. And so again, I asked this question, like, which group is my family in? How, where's my family in all of this? And then, of course, that got me to thinking about what are the impacts of policies that are occurring in the wake of the pandemic, that are demonizing some groups as being more prone to carrying disease or being less clean. What are the impacts on students when teachers nationally and locally, both Cherokee and non-Cherokee, are adopting these racist, nativist, xenophobic attitudes toward the most vulnerable Native people? And so what did it mean to be a Cherokee speaker during this period? That this would have been that one of the things I note in my first book is that the Cherokee Nation was always comfortable with multilingualism in most of its institutions, arguably not the seminaries as much, but certainly in the public schools there was room for bilingualism. Certainly in tribal government there was room for bilingualism, and in the courts there was room for bilingualism. And so now we're entering a period where bilingualism is being judged and is being used as a marker of intelligence, or lack of intelligence, as the case may be. So this inability to speak English is being judged by non-native people in whole new ways. And then, of course, I wanted to also think about, like, okay, so how are Cherokee people without these kind of larger governing structures, without a flourishing Cherokee Nation government, how are they overcoming this period? And I had to look kind of to a slightly later moment. So I do think that the implications of these policies lasted into my own father's childhood in particular, but that I also kind of looked at, so for instance, I'll just give you an example again from my own family, that my great aunts and uncles, there were 12 of them, and 6 attended a boarding school relatively close to the home. And those 6 actually spoke Cherokee. And then 6 of them attended the public schools, the younger children. And those 6 were the least proficient in Cherokee. So there's also something to be said for, like, the move into public schools is also potentially doing something relative to, like, weeding out language in families, and that the public schools, in fact, are clearly rewarding language use, and that boarding schools, which had been a part of the Cherokee Nation, Dwight Mission, for instance, had been a part of the Cherokee Nation since even before forced removal, that Dwight Mission had less space for multilingualism in a way that Oklahoma's public schools are not leaving space for multilingualism. And so beyond that, there's also ways in which, for instance, I know that my great-grandmother's home had a dirt floor, and that I know that there had been real tension in the family as some children started attending public schools or boarding schools much further away from home, of judging their own family's home as being impoverished and dirty as a result of these home conditions. So there's a way in which children are coming home from these school experiences with new ideas about, again, simple things like filth and cleanliness that are then spilling over into their own families. So this is a little harder to get at because, of course, Cherokees are all over the place in a variety of different school settings. And so trying to figure out how Cherokees are kind of butting up against this and pushing back on it is really hard to get at in big, massive examples. But there's lots of examples of like, what do you do under these conditions in order to push back on both the poverty that's set in as a result of allotment? And I think that's also interesting that like the poverty created by the state and federal government through the policy of allotment is now weaponized to denigrate Native peoples in this post-statehood moment when they're not flourishing economically. So the state and federal government have created these conditions and then judged Native peoples for these conditions as if it's their own filth and lack of education. So what are families having to do? Well, they're having to engage in itinerant labor. So one of the big itinerancies that you see is that lots of people are laying railroad ties in other parts of the country. So my own family members traveled to Colorado to do this work. And so that supports a family at home. So some family members can stay while other family members are off doing this itinerant labor. There's also, of course, educational and institutional opportunities. So education has been one that Cherokees have supported for generations, and this continues to be the case during this period. So people are still pursuing education. They're still getting getting all sorts of different kinds of education. And then additionally, they're entering the military. And of course, many of you, if you've taken a kind of basic Native studies course, you've probably heard the stat that Native Americans have served number one, in all of every war this country's ever fought, but additionally, that Native Americans serve at a higher per capita rate than any other kind of subgroup within society. So even before Native peoples are full citizens, they're serving at in intense rates within the larger military. So again, people are joining the military. And of course, a lot of the literature kind of points us to, oh, there's this warrior ethic. I also, because I spend a lot of time thinking about the work of pensions from military service, starting with the War of 1812, I think about pensions through after the treaties of 1866 and the Civil War. But pensions are a social welfare service. So joining the military means that your family will have access to social welfare through time given to service. So whether that's pensions, your risk if you've lost your life, your family is still going to get potentially a widow's pension, or if you're disabled through the process, you're going to receive a disability pension. And so we can't just think about this as this longer warrior ethic where men are going to fight in wars. That there's also something to be said for the kind of social support that serving in the military is providing to Native families back home. And then what I really want to highlight too is this kind of larger notion of Gadugi, which is kind of we are helping each other, that this is a core value within Cherokee society, that you in fact step forward and support each other when necessary. So for instance, obviously there's a lot of scientific agriculture being pushed during this period, but often scientific agriculture required really expensive equipment. And so very few people had access to the newest plows or the newest equipment. And so what you see in the records very often is that one person in the community will make the purchase. And then that particular piece of equipment will be shared community-wide. And so you continue to see that post-statehood as a way of kind of continuing to support each other. The other thing that you see in terms of Gadugi is that there are still spiritual societies, and the Gadua Society is one of those that my own family was a part of, that continue to support traditional peoples and Cherokee language speakers within the community, that beyond just kind of abiding by these older ceremonies, there's also a real ethic to supporting each other financially. So for instance, in records at the University of Tulsa, there's just pages and pages of these tiny little what's seemingly kind of a really nominal amount of money being given to the Gadua Society that adds up to lots of money over time, and that the goal of the group was to give out no interest loans to people in order to help them through these moments. Now, the other thing, how else do we look for how you get through this educationally? So how is all of this, all of these attitudes and beliefs that are being thrust at Native children in schools, how are people responding to that? And I did a kind of version of this talk with a Cherokee community group, and I laugh that I always learn more when I go to those settings than I actually offer up. And without fail, all of the older members of this group told me stories of kind of moments in this kind of early period in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where they knew that their own families had situations. So for instance, one of the members of a group told me that a full-blooded child had started attending a school, and that the teacher denigrated the child and made them sit on the floor. And that one of the bicultural students went home and told their family about this new teacher's treatment of the student. And that in fact, they confronted the teacher's husband on the street and said, you need to leave town. You need to go now. and this type of situation, I don't just hear it from one person in one community. There's a way in which these kind of larger protections of Native peoples around issues related to language, around issues related to race, are being acted out informally, but within communities through a variety of mechanisms of kind of coming together to offer protection against members of the community who are being harmed by these new attitudes and beliefs that non-Native teachers mostly are bringing to children within what were formerly Cherokee-controlled communities. So I also want to say that I think there's, that there's a whole variety of other things that I think support these efforts, and the way they get reported is also interesting. So I spend a lot of time talking about the role of strawberries in Oklahoma, and this kind of connects back to one of the themes of the book that's thinking about land. And Angie DeBow writes about these agricultural projects that took place kind of through the WPA projects and through this period, and what she credits them to. And Angie DeBow, I have nothing but respect for the work that she does relative to Oklahoma history and Native history within Oklahoma. But all of her emphasis in this particular report that she filed was placed on these teachers brought in by the federal government during this period in order to educate Native people and to get kids into schools. They were teaching at the federal boarding school in Tahlequah, which is the former capital of the Cherokee Nation, and again, the capital today. And DeBow spends all of her time telling us about these white kind of do-gooders who come in to do good work. And there's another side to what DeBow is actually highlighting that in some ways DeBow misses, is that she describes this teacher actually having to live within the community for 6 weeks in advance of starting her position at Sequoia boarding school. And she lives with this elder woman. And DeBow never names this elder Cherokee woman, but in fact, this elder Cherokee woman is walking this teacher through the community. She's walking her through the woods. She's introducing her to other members of the community. She's telling her about the land itself. And so embedded in all of that is, like, on the one hand, yes, this white teacher's there and she's doing work relative to Sequoia. And on the other hand, she's very much reliant on the continued knowledge of both the community and of the role of Native women within those communities to kind of act as educators themselves. And then, of course, these larger agricultural projects, she spends a lot of time talking about strawberries as this this major thrust for this moment. And again, my own father picked strawberries as a child when he was 5 and 6 years old in order to contribute to his own family. So they would come around in wagons and pick Cherokee people up, take them to fields to work for the day, and then bring them home by wagon at the end of the day. So, and strawberries were one of the items they picked. And on the other hand, DeBow kind of misses that there's a way in which strawberries connect Cherokee people to the homelands in the East. And strawberries have been a part of Cherokee cosmology and Cherokee life for millennia. And DeBow is completely uninterested in that. And so there's a way in which, again, that communities are kind of coming together around kind of older values and principles connected to God Dookie to support each other, that sustain people during what is an extremely dark economic moment, but also an extremely dark, I think, racial moment for many Cherokee people. That simply didn't exist for them when Cherokee Nation was governing itself in the 19th century. And so I'm gonna stop there. I've included all my sources, but I want to leave time for your questions and hear from you all, and go back over anything that you'd like me to kind of extrapolate on more. So I'm happy to do that. Again, thank you all for being here today.
Awesome. Thank you. So we do have, thank you very much. Before we go on to the questions for the presentation, very fascinating stuff that really speaks to a lot of my interests. So I really enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much. And I do have some questions here that people have been sending us in. I will also remind the studio audience here that you can send us questions via the Q&A box towards the bottom of your screen. Should be the bottom of your screen. If you're on a phone, it might be in a different spot, but you can definitely send us questions and we'll answer them there. So the first question, which actually kind of speaks to the slide you have up here, is where do you find most of the records that you use in your research / books?
Yeah, so one thing I will say is that there's no doubt that records are complicated when it comes to we don't always have the perfect records, let me say, or the records we're always seeking. And I think that's true for researchers broadly, but when we're dealing with populations who are not producing the records, in the case of the 5 tribes, though, the 5 tribes have been producing English language records since before the 19th century. And added to that, once you have the Cherokee Nation Press operating, you have bilingual records to work off. And then, of course, the 19th century, especially the second half, when newspapers really explode across the country more broadly, that's true in Indian Territory as well. So there are multiple papers being produced throughout the 19th century that are being edited by Native peoples, that are being contributed to by Native peoples. And then the trick, I mean, post-statehood, there's kind of this is where there's both holes in the records, because you would think that, like, as we get closer to the current moment, there's a lot more records. But once the 5 tribes are kind of dissolved, you're not able to find people in kind of Cherokee Nation records to kind of immediately identify them as Cherokee, right? So instead, I'm having to follow people that I'm already familiar with, that I can kind of immediately understand that these people are Cherokee, even though they're now being kind of classified by the state of Oklahoma as residents in Oklahoma and American citizens, right? So I don't think I could have done this particular chapter without kind of really having a good sense of kind of who Cherokee people are at the close of the 19th century, moving into the 20th, in order to continue tracking them. So the other thing I would say is that the Cherokee, all of the 5 tribes produce their own governmental records, which are available in the Western History collections at OU. There are also records held within, to some extent, our own tribal government. So the Cherokee Nation has a research center. They're also in little tiny libraries all over Oklahoma. So I spend a lot of time in really obscure community libraries looking through the records that they have. The other thing that I would say relative to 5 tribes and to Cherokee specifically is that now that things have been digitized in such high numbers, the American state papers are now digitized by kind of the late 18th, early 19th century. We also have Fold 3 available to us, which is, by the way, much cheaper to buy as an individual than it is for institutions. So a lot of institutions have not bought access, but you can buy access. And Fold 3 has the Tennessee Indian Agency records, which cover kind of the first decades of the 19th century heavily, that cover, again, Cherokees a lot, but 5 tribes more broadly as well. There's also the allotment records. So if you're dealing in the allotment records, I definitely recommend you read Rose Stremlau's book, Sustaining the Cherokee Family, because that one helps kind of make sense of those records, because there's a lot of bias wrapped up in those records and on any range of levels. And so those records are available through Fold 3 as well, and some through Ancestry's library edition. So I don't lack for records. Again, the trick in the 20th century is just being able to trace people out once the tribal governments have been disbanded, because the tribes are no longer creating their own census records. They're no longer creating their own governmental records. They're no longer creating their own school records. And so it gets a little trickier. And I suspect I'm going to say more about this when I field this next question as well. So I'm not sure if I can jump ahead to that other question that I see relative to Black Cherokees. And
absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is one thing I found interesting. So I've looked at a lot of educational records in Oklahoma, because they were still doing school censuses. And those records actually list complete households. So they're listing parents, they're listing children, they're listing what school kids are attending. You don't get a sense of how much they're attending school. So they're all there, but you don't know who's come for 70 days and who's come for 100 days and who's come for only 14. But one of the things that I have found astounding and unfortunate is that in that period after statehood, much like the creation of those Dawes rolls, which demarcated people by race, those who are Cherokee by blood and those who are freedmen, which doesn't tell us a complete story either. But after statehood, you don't even see that freedman designation play out in the same way. And so, for instance, when I'm looking at my own community in Oklahoma, a little town called Vian, there are an astounding number of African-American students in that public school, so kind of surprisingly so, because I had never looked at the demographics in the post-statehood moment. But the Cherokees are listed as Indian, right? These Cherokees by blood are listed as Indian. But for all of those people listed as African American, there's an assumption that they are not Cherokee or that they are not Native, and that I just can't hold that to be true. That just doesn't make sense, and so you're losing a kind of designation that probably would have still been there within a Cherokee context that's being lost to an Oklahoma racial context. So that gets much trickier. And that's when I have to rely on, lots of other scholars' work who are doing kind of exclusively focusing on African Cherokees or African Native people in Oklahoma who've delved into families, and then that enables me to kind of follow their they've done that kind of heavy lifting, and then I can kind of take it from there of like, oh, these people are showing up in my community too. Now I can kind of unthread what's happening to them within those communities. So it actually gets much trickier to follow African Cherokee people in that post-statehood moment because of the designations that are happening relative to schools. And I'm going to make sure that I answered that whole question.
There's also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go for it.
I was going to say there's also, I think, another question that's pretty closely related. The third question at the bottom, how did relationships and entanglements of diverse Native Americans, Black freed people, and many peoples of different backgrounds and identities that converge in the state of Oklahoma Indian Territory affect these dynamics of Cherokee living and education through the pandemic of the early 20th century?
Yeah, and hi, Farina, and congratulations. Uh, so, um, one, so I think that this is also a moment that gets really complicated, right? Because I actually was listening to a talk by Elena Roberts, who has just published a new book on both it deals with Reconstruction, but also African Native peoples amongst the 5 tribes that I don't have a copy of yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But that she made an interesting point, and I think it's worth kind of revisiting, is that this is a moment when, in fact, we have to look at these really complicated relationships between policies that are playing out within the larger US and how these policies are playing out for the 5 tribes. So for instance, if we think about the promises of land in the post-Civil War moment, where freed people are hoping to receive 40 acres of land, right? That leads to all sorts of rhetoric related to Indian Territory, where you have kind of a rush of freed people heading to Indian Territory in anticipation of potentially getting free land. And so there's a bureaucratic kind of difficulty that's created in this late period, as the 5 tribes don't have the bureaucratic mechanisms to kind of sort out who's a citizen, who isn't, who's coming back from having been displaced by war, who was formerly enslaved by the 5 tribes but is now free and is entitled to citizenship, and then of course who's here just to kind of grab onto this moment of potentially free land. Now, the other side of this, and I think there's some interesting conversations happening, especially related to the Tulsa race massacre, is that there's no way we can talk about the Greenwood community without also talking about allotment, and without also talking about the fact that the freed people of the 5 tribes received allotted lands from those native, out of the body of Native Nations collective land holdings, and that becomes an economic base for many of those freed people that are coming out of the 5 tribes, and that kind of forms part of the conversation we have to have about Black Wall Street in Tulsa. On the other hand, we also have to think about the ways that the 5 tribes specifically created a racial hierarchy in the state of Oklahoma that made sure to position themselves in a better place than African Americans and African Native peoples more broadly. And so they've made sure that in terms of categorization, that Native peoples are not going to be cast as people of color in the state of Oklahoma. And so that leaves many former citizens of the 5 tribes especially vulnerable to Jim Crow, especially vulnerable to racial laws being constructed by the state of Oklahoma, that Cherokee and Choctaw and Creek and Chickasaw people are perhaps not being subjected to in those ways legally, right? I don't want to say that in the everyday, people weren't being subjected to all sorts of racist treatment, but at least in terms of the law, they are not being classified as people of color the way that African Americans are in the state of Oklahoma. Additionally, I think that as we start to think about later periods, and Farina, I'd love to have a follow-up conversation with you about this, but in later periods, when you start to see funds coming from the federal government to fund Native students in public schools, right? So that federal funds are starting to be funneled into schools for educational projects after the New Deal, and of course, through the 1970s and even to today, that if you have, in this post-Oklahoma moment, stopped classifying formerly Native Black people as Native within these kind of larger school censuses, you've erased the obligations of those funds to those students right? So one of the things that I find fascinating, and I didn't, talk about this writ large, but one of the huge debates in the post-Oklahoma moment is all about school funding. And there is major hostility against Native peoples because of all this untaxed land, right? And that this untaxed land is leading public schools to not being funded adequately. Now, we can set aside like how dispossession is it's benefiting the state of Oklahoma, and all of these institutions that have been built are benefiting the state of Oklahoma. But there is a whole way in which one of the things that we have to think about is that for Black Native people that were designated as freed people, they didn't have those protections, so they're becoming taxed at a much earlier moment. They're becoming taxed people based on those allotments much earlier than people who have blood quantums that are on those by blood rolls. So then you've got a situation where formerly African Cherokee people are being taxed and participating in funding the public schools, but are also being racially discriminated against within the state of Oklahoma. So all of these interesting funding questions, I think, again, like I don't like to follow the money too much, but I do wind up kind of seeing these conversations play out, and they're fascinating. And so then you've got, again, kind of formerly Black Native, by classification of citizenship, people contributing to the funds of the public schools, Native peoples who have higher blood quantums not contributing to those funds because they're on untaxed land. And this creates a lot of hostility by public school officials toward Native people, that they are not paying their way in terms of public schools. And then, of course, then we get into like larger discussions about land distributions and who's entitled to some of the monies that are still being paid out relative to the 5 tribes. And so there is a real kind of entrenchment of resource questions, I think, relative to public schools that get exasperated around issues of race because of how these classifications wind up playing out post-statehood. I don't know if that answered your question, Farina, and of course, I would love to have a longer conversation with you at some point.
Thank you. And I will jump in, and I had a follow-up question from something you said earlier. So you mentioned that one of the issues you've had tracing sources has been tracing the people, right? That eventually people are not being identified as Cherokee anymore. And could you speak a little bit more about that and say why that is that people aren't self-identifying? It's the state of Oklahoma is not identifying them. And can you postulate as to why that is occurring?
Yeah, so I'll tell you where I started thinking about this is that, and again, Farina's been right in the middle of this for the last couple of years, is that during this moment, again, kind of in this larger context of memorialization of the Civil War and monuments to the Confederacy, and of course, there were 2 major monuments removed from the Cherokee Nation over the past couple of years that were dedicated to Confederates and Confederate Cherokees. And of course, we're having these conversations more broadly across the nation. But there was an immediate assumption that the daughters of the Confederacy who had put forward these statues, that these are not Cherokee people that are doing this. And I took all the names and started digging into them, and I was like, oh yeah, these are white Cherokee women that are absolutely doing this. Now, they're not citizens of the Cherokee Nation because it's been dissolved, right? So, but these are people who are laying claim in really kind of interesting and fascinating ways, because often they're non-Cherokee fathers who have served in the Confederacy. And so they're both, on the one hand, kind of grabbing on to Cherokee participation in the Civil War in order to elevate their non-Cherokee fathers' participations in the Civil War. And I never actually get their Cherokee mothers' names very often. So it's like that Cherokee side of their family is diminished in some of these moments, because people are kind of, I think there's a way in which, and I see this in the early 19th century when the Cherokee Nation is first establishing its citizenship laws, of like, well, who are you going to throw your lot in with? Like, who's going to better protect your interest? The United States and your family's interests. And so you see some of these debates happening pre-statehood within the five tribes more broadly, is like, well, what's in my best interest? If I'm a cattle rancher who wants a monopoly on acreage, like, we shouldn't necessarily assume that they're necessarily going to throw their lot in with the US, because those monopolies might get broken up. But if you're a Black Cherokee that's doing very well in cattle ranching within the Cherokee Nation, then in fact, you know, you have maybe even a greater vested interest in maintaining communal land holdings, because God only knows what would happen to you within the larger US. So after statehood, it all becomes about like blood quantum and status relative to allotments. And so there are categories that are put in place that say that if at a certain point, if you're half or more Indian blood, that you are not competent to manage your land unless you get kind of special permission to sell your land, to lease your land, to take a mortgage, or to kind of use that land as equity in certain kinds of ways. And so those who have less than half, or just by that supposed blood quantum, assumed to be more competent to manage their own affairs. And so very often, once those restrictions on land are lifted, you start to see people get classified in different kinds of ways. And then if we think about this moment as an extremely racialized one, where Native peoples are being discussed, and the rhetoric has turned ugly in all sorts of ways relative to cleanliness and wealth and education, that there are lots of people who kind of shy away from that. I want to add a caveat that that's not happening during the making of the rules. Like, people aren't hiding from the rules because they don't want to be, they don't want to be Native. That comes later. People are turning away from nativeness because they want to throw their lot in with white people. They want to throw their lot in with white America. And so they're turning their back on Indianness because they can pass, because they have the educational wherewithal to do that, because they have the language skills. And so people are making certain kinds of choices about how they identify in that post-statehood moment, but it's also wrapped up in this blood quantum piece. And so so very, very often, and of course, newspapers are no longer making, they're no longer being published by Native entities. They may have a white editor, they may have other people that are producing the paper, and they aren't necessarily making those designations anymore. So you can't make assumptions about, oh, well, just because this newspaper is being published in what was formerly the Cherokee Nation, that the people being discussed are necessarily Cherokee people. They could be interlopers, they could be settlers, they could be intermarried. They could, there's all sorts of ways that we have to think about who these people are. So you really have to kind of be able to track people in some other kinds of ways. So it's both constructions of blood quantum by the state and federal government, but also how people are the ability of people to kind of recast themselves in certain kinds of ways. The other thing I would say is that people are also throwing in completely on ideas of Indianness. So if we think about Robert L. Owen's mother, she kind of casts herself as a Native princess. Will Rogers is a part of kind of what was originally a women's organization called the Pocahontas Club, which in the Northeast is like a bunch of white women appropriating Native identity, but in the Cherokee Nation is a bunch of Native people engaging in kind of club work around this Pocahontas identity. So you have to kind of look for how these things are being deployed, and why people might make a choice to kind of recast themselves in a particular way in another moment. And I would say that's also true of, say, African Native people, like, that there are choices being made there too. in terms of if there isn't a Cherokee Nation to kind of associate yourself with, or be that isn't organized and recognized in all sorts of ways, and that the Cherokee Nation and the other 5 tribes have kind of determined that they are going to cast people in racialized ways, that you might then decide that like your best interests, the organizations, the communities that you might throw in with are African-American organizations or African-American churches. And then of course we have a whole body of Black Native communities in Oklahoma that we have to reckon with. So I think there's all sorts of factors that shape how the kind of stressors that lead people to kind of disappear from the records as Native, but also ways that they continue to show up. But you have to kind of know where those communities are, know when people arrived, know the kind of longer histories of those communities in order to kind of figure out what's exactly who all these people are. And it could be all of those people in the same space.
Awesome thing. I imagined it was complex, and indeed it is. Thank you. We have another question here. Dr. Reed, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. There was an epidemic of smallpox in Indian Territory, 1898 to 1902. Do you find similar conversations about education, race, and public health happening in Cherokee Nation during that period?
Yes and no. So my first book, I actually kind of open and close with vignettes about smallpox vaccinations, which were about 100 years apart. So there was a push to inoculate Cherokee people in the first decade of the 19th century, and then there's a push to do a kind of smallpox treatment in the exact period that you're describing. And of course, the years that you have just put up are the years that the DAWS is coming into play, right? So there's a massive amount of pressure on Native nations to allot lands during this exact moment. And so one of the things that I would say is that the Cherokee Nation has been engaged in a lot of different public health discussions for 100 years by this 1898 to 1902 epidemic. There are lots of, there's the Indian Territory Medical Association that's operating, and doctors are being licensed by the Cherokee Nation by this period. So the Cherokee Nation has also had some compulsory vaccinations that have already taken place by this period. There had been some pushes even during removal to inoculate Native peoples. And so it's not as if Native peoples are caught off guard by that smallpox moment. What I would say is that I think that a lot of the pushback that you see during that moment, because especially, for instance, there's a case at the male seminary where they're going to force everyone there to be inoculated. And one particular teacher fights, adamantly opposes being treated and leaves, just simply leaves the facility and avoids being inoculated and treated. There's other kind of resistances that happen. And I do kind of think about that as a moment of like, all of these other pressures are bearing down on Cherokee people relative to their continued existence as a Native nation and a continued existence of communal land holdings. And that people are trying to control parts of their life that they can. And so you see on the one hand, the Cherokee Nation's impulse is to do these public health measures. And on the other hand, you do have individuals that are pushing back hard on those public health treatments. And of course, they're coming through institutions. So, it's easy to vaccinate people at the institutions themselves. The degree to which the larger community is being vaccinated is less clear because that's not showing up in the records so much. But certainly by this smallpox epidemic, Cherokee people have been engaged in conversations about vaccination for well over 100 years. And you do still see, even in that post-statehood moment, like there is still an engagement with public health measures. So some of my great uncles describe having to be picked up by a truck and taken up to Tulsa for treatment for their eyes, making sure that their eyes are being cared for and they're not succumbing to other kinds of public health illnesses. And the families are taking their children to go through this process. So it isn't as if, even within local communities, people are completely resistant, but you do see resistance to some of these measures, both pre and post. I think one of the things that you don't see as formally after statehood is kind of organized, the organized ability to kind of push back through political parties or through political bodies to resist some of these measures, that those just don't, particularly under the pressures of allotment, when so much pressure is bearing down on people, do you have the energy to kind of organize against some public health measure, some racist teacher? And you do it in the ways that you can, but you can't do it in the ways that were done collectively pre-statehood.
Thank you. Any more questions? Feel free to pop in one or two. We're just about out of time, so if there are any more, we can field those, or Dr. Reed can field those. I did have one question, if nothing else pops in here, and that's what kind of connections do you see between the 1918 flu epidemic, which lasted a little bit more than 1918, and what we're currently facing, particularly as it pertains to Native peoples? We could keep it to the Cherokee Nation or spread it out more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's hopefully, I would argue that they're very different moments, right? That we're in an era of tribal self-determination. And so many Native nations have kind of tackled this head on, particularly in states where politically there isn't the will, there hasn't been the will to kind of see the urgency. So, Native nations understand that, so I would say Cherokee Nation is aware every single year during flu season, a regular flu season, that our speakers are in danger. That if you're down to 2,000 speakers, that a bad flu season can take a sizable number of those. A pandemic can take even more, and the numbers have been startling. I mean, it's hard to even think about those losses without understanding the urgency to what's been lost this past year. And I should add that, and again, when I think about this kind of earlier moment relative to the flu pandemic, that my great-great-grandfather, Redbird Smith, who was a leader of the Stomp Grounds and the Gadua Society, that there's a story that I was told that when all of these guys went off to the World War, that the Gadua Society offered a blessing and prayers to protect all of those Gaduas who were headed off. And the oral tradition that I've heard is that they all came back. They all came back. But they also brought the flu pandemic back with them. And it's as a result of the flu pandemic that my grandfather died. So I think that within our own communities, we're kind of cognizant of the real loss, right? That when you are acutely aware of what demographic losses can do to your community, that you are going to do the best you can. And we may not always agree with what the best thing may be, but I think that Native nations generally, I mean, if we think about the Cheyenne, if we think about the Dene, that these communities have recognized that there are real severe threats to the historic traditions of their communities, to the language traditions of their communities, and that we can't sit by and do nothing. And that if we have the ability to act in ways that, again, if we think about this idea of Gadu Gi, that it's our responsibility to care for each other. That's what we're called to do. It's not about me and mine. It's not about the individualism. It's about we are called to care for each other. And so the idea that we wouldn't care for each other and do everything we could to make sure our elders are protected is anathema. Even if our elders don't want to be protected, right? Like, that it's still our responsibility to protect them. And so I have I have been, just in awe of Indian country broadly in terms of its ability to kind of to wrestle with this. Added to that, I think that it's worth noting that, even though the tribes very often have control over healthcare systems within their communities, there's also a much more direct line between the federal government and Native nations, right? So that, for instance, in the state of Oklahoma, the tribes have been doing the work of vaccination. In places like Alaska, it's the tribes that are doing the work of vaccination. And so there's this way, I mean, shoot, that I know the tribes in Oklahoma have opened it up to people living outside of Oklahoma. And so there's a and the other thing that many communities have done is vaccinate the whole family. So what sense does it make to vaccinate grandma if you're not vaccinating the children who are living with grandma? And so the holistic approach to all of that, I have said to myself over and over again, this is what Indian country can offer, right? That like these kinds of models have been affirming in so many ways, and true models for perhaps the kind of ethos that I wish we could say would have been more widespread, and the kind of public health campaigns that have been brilliant and beautiful. And so I just, it's been affirming to see, like, when tribes have the ability to act in their own best interest, what they're capable of. And I contrast that with the moment in 1918, when tribes are not empowered and don't have the economic resources or the governmental structures to make that happen. The one caveat I would add is that I think the way that tribes get demonized in that moment, we can't look past the way that Asian Americans have been demonized in this moment, right? That the rhetoric and the language we use has consequences. And that was true in 1918, and it's true in slightly different ways in 2021. And so, I both think about the ways that 1918 can inform us, and there's a lot of parallels, and then the ways in which, at least in terms of Indian country, that I think there's some profound differences.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And with that, a couple quick announcements as we phase out. And one thing is a reminder for Virginia Tech students that we have a conversation tomorrow with Dr. Reed. So if you're interested and you are a Virginia Tech student, send me an email. I'll put that in the chat in a second, and I will send you the link. And the second thing I'll say is I forgot to mention the song we listened to as we began this event was a song by Red Eagle, who's a Choctaw rapper from Oklahoma City. The song is called Still Here. So to kind of pay respect to the artist here. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Reed for this fantastic talk on behalf of the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center here at Virginia Tech, and also the Department of History. And thank you so much. It was fantastic. We'll see you all. And make sure, if you are listening to this, whether it's the recording or live, get vaccinated, wear a mask, drink some water, stay healthy, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.